Something just shifted, and most people still have not fully processed it. It did not arrive with a clear headline saying, "This is the moment everything changes." There was no single announcement that neatly explained what had just happened. Instead, it arrived in fragments. One development here, one reaction there, a subtle change in tone, a quiet shift in language, a different posture. And yet, when you step back and connect those fragments, another picture begins to form. A picture suggesting this is not just another political incident. It is a turning point. Not the kind that explodes overnight, not the kind that shakes the room in one loud second, but the kind that quietly rearranges the pieces on the board until, suddenly, the entire game looks different. At the center of this moment is Donald Trump. But focusing only on the individual misses the larger story. Because what we are really seeing is not just about one person. It is about a system under pressure, a system reacting to uncertainty, a system revealing its fault lines in real time. And this incident, whatever angle you approach it from, has touched those fault lines in a way that feels different from before. To understand why, we need to slow down. We need to look carefully at how these moments actually work. Because in geopolitics, the most important shifts are rarely obvious at first. They do not announce themselves clearly. They emerge through patterns that only become visible when you connect the dots over time. So let us start with a simple question. Why does this feel bigger? After all, political controversies are not new. The global audience has already seen intense elections, legal battles, public disputes, and sudden developments many times before. Headlines come and go, narratives rise and fall, attention shifts quickly, but every once in a while an event breaks that pattern. It does not fade as expected. It does not behave like previous incidents. Instead, it lingers. It evolves. It starts influencing things that seem unrelated at first glance, and that is when you know something deeper is happening. This moment carries that feeling, and the reason lies in timing. Timing in geopolitics is everything. The same event can have completely different consequences depending on when it occurs. Right now, the global environment is already under strain. There are competing economic pressures, shifting alliances, and an ongoing rebalancing of power between major states. There is also a growing sense that the old frameworks, the ones that defined stability for decades, are no longer as reliable as they once were. In that environment, even a small disruption can echo loudly. But this was not a small disruption. It intersected with existing tensions. It amplified ongoing debates. It introduced new uncertainty into an already fragile equation. And that is where things start to change. Because uncertainty has a unique effect on systems. It forces recalculation. Governments begin to rethink their assumptions. Analysts revisit their forecasts. Markets adjust their expectations. Even public opinion starts to shift. Not always dramatically, but enough to alter the direction of conversations. And conversations are powerful. They shape what people pay attention to. They influence what leaders prioritize. They determine which issues gain momentum and which ones fade into the background. This incident has already begun to reshape those conversations. But to see how, we need to look at the layers beneath the surface. At the domestic level, the United States is entering a period of heightened political sensitivity. Every signal matters. Every development is interpreted through multiple lenses. Supporters, critics, and undecided observers all process the same event differently. But the event itself becomes a focal point. Not because everyone agrees on its meaning, but because everyone recognizes its significance. That creates intensity, and intensity changes dynamics. Campaign strategies adjust. Messaging becomes sharper. Media cycles accelerate. The pace of political movement increases. This does not necessarily lead to immediate outcomes, but it changes the environment in which those outcomes will eventually emerge. And that environment is now more charged than before. But the domestic layer is only part of the story. The international layer may be even more important. Because while internal reactions can be loud and visible, external reactions are often quieter and more strategic. Allies of the United States are watching carefully, not just for what this incident means today, but for what it suggests about tomorrow. Stability, consistency, and predictability are key elements in international relationships. When any of those elements appears uncertain, even slightly, it prompts a reassessment, not a dramatic shift, not an immediate change in alliances, but a subtle adjustment in expectations. And those adjustments matter over time. For example, when policymakers in allied countries evaluate their future plans, they rely on assumptions about U.S. leadership and direction. If those assumptions become less certain, they may begin to prepare for multiple scenarios instead of one. That does not mean they lose confidence. It means they increase flexibility. And in geopolitics, flexibility is often a response to uncertainty. At the same time, rival states are analyzing the situation from a different perspective. They are not reacting emotionally. They are not engaging in public debates. Instead, they are observing patterns, identifying potential openings. and assessing how this moment might influence broader strategic trends. They ask different questions. Does this create distraction? Does this shift attention inward? Does this alter policy priorities, even temporarily? The answers to those questions are not always immediate, but the process of asking them shapes long-term strategies. Because geopolitics is not just about reacting to events, it is about anticipating trajectories, and this incident feeds directly into that anticipation. Now, there is another layer that often goes unnoticed, but it is absolutely critical: narrative control. In the modern world, events do not exist in isolation. They are interpreted, framed, and amplified through media ecosystems that operate at incredible speed. Within hours, a single incident can generate dozens of narratives, each competing for attention. Some narratives emphasize risk, others emphasize resilience, some focus on conflict, others highlight opportunity. And over time, one or more of these narratives begins to dominate. That dominant narrative shapes perception, and perception shapes reality. This is one of the most important dynamics to understand, because even if the underlying facts remain the same, the way those facts are perceived can lead to very different outcomes. Markets can rise or fall based on perception. Diplomatic signals can strengthen or weaken based on perception. Public confidence can shift dramatically based on perception. So the question is not just what happened, it is how it is being understood. And right now that understanding is still evolving. Different groups are pushing different interpretations. Media outlets are framing the story in different ways. International observers are filtering it through their own strategic lenses. This creates a kind of narrative competition, and whichever narrative gains momentum will influence the next phase of events. But let us go deeper, because this moment is not just about immediate reactions. It is about patterns. Over the past decade, there has been a noticeable shift in how political power operates. Traditional structures, formal institutions, established alliances, and long-standing norms still matter. They absolutely still matter. But they are no longer the only drivers of influence. Speed matters more now. Adaptability matters more now. And perhaps most importantly, the ability to shape attention has become a form of power in itself. Donald Trump has consistently operated within that space. His political style, regardless of how one evaluates it, has been defined by an ability to capture attention, to disrupt existing narratives, and to force rapid shifts in public focus. This incident fits into that broader pattern, but it also expands it. Because the context has changed, the global system is more interconnected than ever. Information travels instantly. Reactions are amplified across platforms. Even small signals can have wide-reaching effects. So when an event involving a figure like Trump occurs, it does not stay contained within national borders. It becomes part of a global conversation. And that global conversation is what gives this moment its weight. Now let us consider the strategic implications more carefully. One possible outcome is increased political polarization within the United States, not necessarily in a new direction, but in a more intensified form. When events like this occur, they tend to reinforce existing divisions while also drawing in those who were previously less engaged. That increases participation, it increases attention, and it raises the stakes for future developments. Another possible outcome is a shift in how international partners approach their relationships with the United States. Not in terms of immediate policy changes, but in terms of long-term planning. Countries may begin to diversify their strategies slightly, making sure they are prepared for multiple potential scenarios. This is not a sign of instability, it is a sign of adaptation. And adaptation is a natural response to uncertainty. A third possible outcome involves rival states adjusting their timelines, not necessarily taking immediate action, but positioning themselves to respond quickly if opportunities arise. Again, this is not about dramatic moves, it is about readiness. And readiness is often shaped by moments like this. But beyond these specific outcomes, there is a broader implication, a shift in expectations. Expectations are powerful because they influence behavior before anything actually happens. If people expect stability, they act one way. If they expect change, they act differently. This incident has introduced a new variable into those expectations, and that variable is still being processed. Now, let us address an important point. It is easy to overstate moments like this. It is easy to assume they will immediately transform everything, to predict dramatic outcomes with certainty. But that is not how geopolitics works. Real change is usually gradual. It unfolds through a series of adjustments, reactions, and recalibrations. Moments like this do not guarantee a specific outcome, but they expand the range of possibilities. They open doors. And once those doors are open, different paths become available. Some of those paths lead to continuity. Others lead to change. And often, the final outcome is a combination of both. So the key is not to focus on one scenario. The key is to understand the landscape of possibilities. That is where real insight comes from. Now think about how this moment will be remembered. Not necessarily as a single event, but as part of a sequence. a sequence that includes rising global competition, shifting alliances, and evolving political strategies. In that sequence, this incident may come to represent a point where things began to feel different, where assumptions were questioned, where expectations were adjusted, where the future became slightly less predictable and therefore more important to watch. Because unpredictability draws attention, and attention drives momentum. The more people focus on a moment, the more influence it gains. That is another reason this incident matters. It has captured attention across multiple layers: political, economic, and strategic. And once attention is captured, it tends to sustain itself, at least for a while. Now, let us bring this back to the central idea. Why does this change everything? Not because it guarantees a specific result, not because it immediately transforms policies or alliances, but because it alters the conditions under which those things evolve. It changes the starting point for future decisions. It reshapes the context in which strategies are developed. It influences how different actors interpret the world around them. And that influence, even if subtle at first, can grow over time. That is how real change happens, not through a single dramatic moment, but through a series of connected shifts that build on each other. This incident is one of those shifts. It may not be the final one. It may not even be the largest one, but it is part of a chain. And understanding that chain is what allows us to see where things might be heading. So, as the story continues to unfold, the most important thing is not to rush to conclusions. It is to observe carefully, to track how narratives develop, to watch how different actors respond, to notice the small changes that signal larger trends. Because in geopolitics, the biggest moves often begin with the smallest signals. And right now, those signals are telling us that something has changed. Not everything. Not yet. But enough to matter. Enough to shift the direction of conversations. Enough to influence the decisions that come next. And enough to remind us that the world is not static. It is constantly moving, constantly adjusting, constantly evolving. Moments like this are part of that process. They do not end the story. They begin a new chapter. And that chapter is still being written. What makes this chapter different is not just the event itself, but the environment in which it exists. The world is more sensitive to disruption than it was even a few years ago. Economic interdependence has increased, but so has strategic competition. Communication is faster, but trust is more fragile. Leaders are under more pressure. Institutions are under more scrutiny. And public expectations are shifting in real time. In that kind of environment, even symbolic moments can carry real weight. This incident is, in many ways, symbolic. It represents tension between continuity and change. It highlights the gap between expectations and reality. And it forces multiple actors to confront uncertainty directly rather than assuming stability. That confrontation is what drives transformation. Because once uncertainty is acknowledged, it cannot be ignored. It has to be managed. And managing uncertainty requires flexibility, awareness, and strategic thinking. Different actors will approach that challenge in different ways. Some will double down on existing strategies, reinforcing what they believe already works. Others will experiment with new approaches, looking for advantages in a shifting landscape. Most will do a combination of both. That is how complex systems adapt. And that adaptation is already underway. You can see it in the way discussions are evolving. You can see it in the questions analysts are asking. You can see it in the tone of international commentary. It is subtle, but it is there. And over time, those subtle changes accumulate. They influence policy decisions. They shape diplomatic interactions. They guide economic planning. And eventually, they become visible in outcomes. That is why it is important to pay attention now. Not because everything has already changed, but because the conditions for change are forming. This is the moment before the shift becomes obvious. The moment when patterns begin to emerge, but are not yet fully recognized. The moment when those who are paying close attention can see what others might miss. And what they see is not a single event. It is a network of connections. Connections between domestic politics and international strategy, between narrative and perception, between uncertainty and adaptation. All of these elements are interacting in real time, and this incident sits right at the center of that interaction. That is what gives it significance. That is what makes it more than just another headline. And that is why, when you step back and look at the bigger picture, it becomes clear that something important has shifted. Not in a loud, obvious way, but in a quiet, structural way. The kind of shift that does not demand attention, but rewards those who notice it. So as this story continues, the real question is not just what will happen next. It is how all these pieces will come together, how narratives will settle, how strategies will evolve, how expectations will adjust. Because in the end, that is what defines the direction of events. Not just the initial moment, but the chain reaction that follows. And that chain reaction has already begun. The signals are there, the patterns are forming, the system is adjusting, and whether those adjustments lead to continuity or change or something in between will depend on how this moment is understood, interpreted, and acted upon in the days and weeks ahead. that is why this changes everything. Because it does not close possibilities, it opens them. And in a world defined by shifting dynamics, the opening of possibilities is where the real story begins. If you found this useful, leave a comment with your thoughts. Like the video, subscribe for more analysis, and tell us what you think this moment could mean next.